January 17, 1945, Western Germany, near the shattered town of Eupen. The snow fell soundlessly over the ruins. The air hung heavy with the burnt scent of fuel and blood. A column of German prisoners, their faces pale beneath torn helmets, stumbled through the haze. Some clutched rags against wounds that had long since frozen over. American guards walked beside them, rifles low, eyes distant, too tired for hatred. Ahead stood a canvas tent marked with a red cross that glowed faintly through the smoke. Inside, the sound of metal trays and hurried footsteps filled the air. American nurses, young, exhausted, their white aprons smeared with mud and iodine, worked under dim lanterns. They had been on their feet for 36 hours, treating whoever was carried in next. When the first German was led through the flap, he hesitated. His uniform was scorched, his leg wrapped in a tourniquet improvised from a belt. The nurse who approached him didn't speak a word. She simply guided him to a cot and began to clean the wound. The man watched in disbelief. The enemy's hands were steady, careful, merciful. Outside, the artillery thundered again. But inside that tent, for a fleeting moment, humanity returned. By early 1945, the Western Front was collapsing, not with glory but exhaustion. The Third Reich's armies were fractured shadows of what they had been just a year before. Since the Allied landings in Normandy the previous June, the push eastward had been relentless. The cost was staggering on both sides. Thousands of men per week, towns reduced to rubble, supply lines stretched to breaking. In December 1944, Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, had erupted with terrifying force. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. For weeks, the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg became killing grounds. Tanks were lost beneath the snow. Entire divisions vanished in fog, and medics worked in ditches with nothing but morphine and faith. When the offensive finally failed in January, the German army began to disintegrate in waves. Thousands of wounded and frostbitten soldiers were left behind, surrendering not out of ideology but survival. As American and British forces advanced, they faced a logistical nightmare. The front lines were moving faster than the hospitals could relocate. The U.S. Army Medical Department, already strained by the sheer volume of casualties, began to establish forward evacuation hospitals in captured territory. These mobile units, some no larger than a few tents and trucks, became sanctuaries of order amid chaos. Here, nurses from the Army Nurse Corps worked alongside doctors and field medics, operating day and night under bombardment. They treated whoever arrived, American, British, or German, as dictated by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required medical care for all wounded combatants regardless of uniform. It was not a matter of sentimentality. It was a principle, one that tested the moral endurance of every medic and nurse at the front. For many of these women, the idea of treating the enemy was initially unbearable. They had seen what German shells and snipers had done to their comrades. Some had tended to American boys whose bodies were shattered beyond recognition, victims of the very men now carried in as prisoners. Yet the discipline of medicine, honed through war, demanded neutrality. A wound was a wound, no matter who bore it. Lieutenant Frances Slanger, an army nurse who had landed in Normandy, once wrote in a letter to her family before she was killed by shell fire, "They come to us covered in mud, blood, and fear. We do not ask who they are. We simply start the transfusion." That single sentence became the unspoken creed of hundreds of medical staff across Europe. To the wounded, it often felt unreal, an island of humanity amid a sea of hatred. By late January 1945, there were over 85,000 German prisoners of war in Allied custody in Western Europe, and that number grew by thousands daily. Many were suffering from infected wounds, frostbite, or malnutrition. Field hospitals were never designed to handle such a flood of human suffering, yet the system adapted. U.S. medical trains, converted from freight cars, transported wounded Germans alongside Americans to rear-area hospitals in France and Belgium. At Liège, Reims, and Paris, captured Wehrmacht soldiers were placed in cots next to men from the U.S. First Army. The nurses, guided by training and protocol, moved between them without distinction. One recollection from a nurse at the 12th Evacuation Hospital described it plainly. It was strange. Their uniforms were the same gray we'd been taught to fear, but once the bandages came off, they were just boys. That recognition, the collapse of enemy identity through suffering, would quietly shape post-war memory far more than most realized. The paradox was cruel. The same Allied armies destroying Germany were simultaneously saving German lives behind the lines. In a sense, the medical corps became the conscience of the war machine, the reminder that even total war had boundaries. The Red Cross emblem, painted in crimson on tents and trucks, became a fragile symbol of civility on a continent consumed by revenge. Yet even inside those white canvas walls, The atmosphere was tense. American infantrymen passing by sometimes muttered curses when they saw prisoners receiving morphine or soup. Some believed compassion for the enemy dishonored the dead. But the nurses, many of them in their early 20s, had long ceased to think in terms of sides. They thought in terms of survival. The patient before them was the only reality that mattered. The American command quietly supported this discipline. The Office of the Surgeon General emphasized that medical treatment of POWs was not only a legal obligation, but a strategic one, a demonstration of Allied moral superiority. It showed the world that democracy could fight without becoming what it opposed. In many reports filed during this period, German prisoners expressed shock at being treated fairly. Some even wept. To soldiers conditioned by Nazi propaganda to expect brutality from the Allies, this mercy felt incomprehensible. In the tented wards and makeshift operating rooms of 1945, compassion became a weapon of a different kind, not forged of steel, but of conviction, and yet this was only the surface. Beneath it lay the deeper mechanics of how the Allies managed the largest prisoner population in Western Europe, and why medical ethics became a front line of its own once a German soldier surrendered or was captured. On the Western Front, his ordeal was far from over. The process began almost immediately: identification, disarmament, and classification. But the wounded followed a different route entirely. They were moved under guard to collecting stations, often set up just behind the front line, where American medics performed basic stabilization, stopping bleeding, controlling shock, marking those who needed surgery. From there, military trucks or ambulances carried them to evacuation hospitals, usually 10-15 miles behind the fighting. These facilities were chaotic intersections of life and death. Tents buzzing with generators, the smell of ether mixing with mud. American soldiers lay side by side with the men who had tried to kill them hours earlier. For many captured Germans, it was their first close look at the enemy as human beings. Some had been told that Americans executed prisoners on sight. Instead, they saw nurses in olive drab uniforms moving quietly between cots, giving water, checking pulses, changing dressings. One German corporal later recalled, "They looked at me as if I was not German but simply hurt. I could not understand it." This confusion was common. It was a psychological shock that stripped away the propaganda both sides had been fed for years. Behind this compassion was a highly organized medical machine. By 1945, the U.S. Army Medical Department had developed a 5-step chain of evacuation: aid station, frontline care, collecting station, evacuation hospital, general hospital, rear area, repatriation or POW camp. Hospital. Each step was designed to reduce mortality, regardless of nationality. The Geneva Convention made this explicit. Once wounded, a soldier ceased to be a combatant and became a protected person. Field hospitals were staffed by both doctors and Army Nurse Corps officers, whose presence transformed the war's moral landscape. Before the Second World War, nursing on the battlefield was a rarity for women. By 1945, more than 57,000 American nurses had served in the European theater, often under fire. Their discipline and endurance became a symbol of America's moral authority. They followed a strict hierarchy: triage first by medical priority, not nationality. A severely wounded German might receive surgery before a lightly injured American. This policy was controversial among infantry units, but it remained unbroken. Commanders such as General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk reinforced the rule. Compassion was not optional. It was strategic. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, played a crucial role in ensuring that POWs, including the wounded, received humane treatment. Representatives regularly inspected hospitals, field wards, and transport convoys. They noted that Western Allied care standards far exceeded expectations, especially compared to the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, wounded prisoners often faced execution or abandonment. German and Soviet forces alike ignored the Geneva rules. By contrast, Western Allied forces saw adherence as a point of pride and proof of civilization's endurance under fire. Reports from 1944-45 describe ICRC observers witnessing American nurses tending to Germans in the same wards as U.S. troops, a scene nearly unimaginable elsewhere in Europe. These reports were later used during the Geneva Convention revisions of 1949 as case studies in wartime ethics. Once stabilized, wounded German POWs were transferred to base hospitals in France or Britain, and later to camps in the United States. By mid-1945, ships were crossing the Atlantic loaded with captured soldiers, many still in casts or bandages. The U.S. established special hospital compounds at camps such as Camp Shelby, Mississippi, Camp Swift, Texas, and Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The medical care there often astonished the prisoners. They received surgeries, dental repairs, and rehabilitation therapies. Some POWs even assisted as medical orderlies once they recovered, under supervision, but with growing respect. For many Germans, this treatment left a mark deeper than the war itself. When repatriated after 1946, they carried home stories that contradicted the image of the merciless enemy. These memories became quiet seeds of post-war reconciliation. The contrast between the Western Allies and the Eastern Front could not have been starker. In Soviet captivity, millions of German soldiers died from starvation, exposure, and disease. In the West, survival rates for wounded POWs exceeded 98%. This was not accidental. It was ideological. The Western Allies wanted to prove that democracy could wage total war without losing its soul. Their hospitals were more than medical centers. They were statements of principle. In a war where entire cities were burned and millions perished, the act of binding an enemy's wound became quietly revolutionary. It was a declaration that even in victory humanity could remain intact. And as the Allied armies pressed deeper into Germany, the moral test grew sharper. Soon, compassion would meet its greatest strain in the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, where the line between hatred and duty blurred inside every operating tent. For the men lying on those stretchers, the war had shrunk to a few square feet of white canvas. The thunder of artillery faded into the background hum of generators, the scrape of surgical instruments, and the murmured voices of women who spoke a different language. To the captured Germans, these nurses embodied contradiction. They had been told for years that Americans were monsters, barbarians in uniform, as Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels described them. Yet here, under the dim glow of lanterns, the enemy was wiping their brows and whispering, "You'll be all right." Many prisoners struggled to process it. One German lieutenant captured near Bastogne recalled in an Allied interrogation report, "When she tied the bandage, I saw her hands were shaking. She was younger than my sister. It was impossible to hate her." For the nurses, humanity was not effortless, more it was an act of discipline. Some cried silently after their shifts, unable to reconcile the compassion they were trained to give with the devastation they witnessed daily. Yet in that paradox lay their strength. They treated faces that had worn the same insignia, responsible for the bombing of London, the massacres in Poland, the burned-out tanks littering the Ardennes. But the nurses knew that mercy given under fire was its own form of resistance against dehumanization itself. They could not change the war, but they could decide what kind of humans they would be within it. Behind every act of compassion lay a subtle calculation. The U.S. Army understood that moral conduct on the battlefield was not only right, it was useful. Treating German POWs well had measurable military benefits. It encouraged enemy surrenders. It boosted the morale of Allied troops, reminding them what they fought for, and it became a powerful propaganda weapon in the information war. By 1944, German soldiers were hearing rumors that surrendering to Americans meant survival, while surrendering to Soviets meant disappearance. Allied intelligence spread this message deliberately. Leaflets dropped over the front promised fair treatment and medical care. The promise was not empty, it was enforced by command orders and lived out in the field. Hospitals. Captured German officers often told interrogators that the humane treatment they received had stunned them into rethinking the war. Many wrote about it after 1945. Some even said it was the first time they believed the Nazis could lose not just militarily, but morally. In this way, the nurses became unintentional ambassadors of Allied ideals. Every bandaged wound, every shared cup of soup, was a quiet refutation of the fascist worldview, proof that compassion could coexist with strength. The Geneva Convention, often cited in paperwork, was not what truly kept the nurses bound to their duty. What drove them was the unspoken understanding that cruelty was contagious, and that every act of mercy helped stop its spread. Even on the most pragmatic level, Allied leaders like Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley saw POW care as a way to protect their own soldiers. "How we treat them," one order stated, "will determine how our men are treated." In war, morality was not weakness. It was a form of protection, one that rippled far beyond the battlefield. The frontline hospitals of 1944-45 were unlike anything the world had seen before. They were scientific, mobile, and methodical. War's new anatomy. Each facility functioned like a living organism. Triage tents were the nerves, sensing who needed urgent care. Operating theaters were the heart, pumping life back into the system. And the nurses, they were the hands and conscience of it all. Inside these makeshift wards, nationality dissolved into biology. Surgeons did not see flags. They saw arteries, fractures, gangrene, burns. Blood types mattered more than uniforms. A captured German sergeant might receive plasma drawn from an American donor. In another cot, an American corporal might be stitched with surgical thread made in neutral Switzerland. The shared anatomy of enemies was undeniable. The same pulse, the same pain, the same fragile breath. Medical neutrality was a principle older than this war, but never had it been tested on such a scale. The field hospitals were often targeted despite their Red Cross markings, yet the nurses refused to abandon their work. At Bastogne, during the Bulge, shells tore through the roof of the 45th Evacuation Hospital. Instead of retreating, the nurses dragged patients to safety and continued surgery in the freezing dark. Among those they saved were several captured Germans, men who stared at their rescuers in stunned disbelief. The nurses called it routine. History would later call it moral endurance. These moments stripped war of its illusions. Beneath the ideology, beneath the uniforms, all that remained was the struggle to preserve life, any life. And as the snow melted across the battlefields of 1945, a quiet truth began to spread among both sides. Mercy could wound the soul more deeply than bullets ever could. The human, tactical and medical lenses reveal a single truth. Compassion wasn't weakness, it was power. But there were still other dimensions to this story. Moral leadership, psychology, and the strange way enemies began to see each other in those final months of war. In 1943, long before D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued a directive to all field commanders. The treatment of prisoners of war must be conducted in full compliance with the Geneva Convention. But privately, his reasoning ran deeper. Eisenhower believed that victory without honor was hollow. The Allies were not just fighting for territory. They were fighting to prove that democracy could hold its humanity, even in its most violent hour. He understood that the world was watching. Civilians, neutral nations, and even future generations. Every field hospital, every captured soldier, was a reflection of the civilization the Allies claimed to defend. Eisenhower's Surgeon General, Major General Norman T. Kirk, reinforced this vision. The wounded enemy is no longer the enemy. He is a patient. This simple line echoed down to the tents and wards of Europe. It defined the way medics and nurses acted in the field. Orders were clear. No discrimination in treatment, no neglect, and no retribution. It was not always easy to uphold. Many doctors had lost friends and brothers in battle. There were moments when anger threatened to overcome duty, but Eisenhower's moral clarity became a kind of anchor. He knew that if the Allies surrendered to hate, they would lose something far greater than a war. They would lose the justification for fighting it at all. Under his leadership, the Medical Corps became more than a service branch. It became a moral instrument, demonstrating that decency could survive mechanized slaughter. In an age when entire cities were being bombed into dust, a simple act of mercy became the most radical statement imaginable. For the captured Germans, being treated by American nurses was not merely surprising, it was shattering. It dismantled the propaganda that had shaped their world for years. They had been told that Allied soldiers were barbaric, that surrender meant torture or execution. Instead, they found themselves lying on clean sheets, with morphine easing their pain and food in their hands. Reports collected by Allied intelligence officers in 1945 show repeated statements of disbelief. One POW wrote, "We had been prepared to die. Instead, they saved us. We did not understand such people." Another added, "They fought us hard in the field, but in the hospital they were like angels." In many debriefings, captured officers confessed that this humane treatment left a deeper impression on them than the battles themselves. Some even said it was the first time they questioned the morality of the regime they had served. Among the prisoners who later returned to Germany, a quiet narrative began to spread that the Americans, for all their firepower, were not driven by hatred. That idea, carried home through hundreds of conversations, would later help soften Germany's perception of the United States in the post-war years. Not all prisoners felt gratitude. Some felt humiliation. To be tended by women of the enemy was an unbearable blow to pride. A few refused treatment altogether, believing that accepting kindness from a foe was dishonor. But even that defiance revealed how deeply this compassion cut. It exposed the fragility of ideology when faced with human empathy. The nurses, for their part, rarely spoke to the Germans. Communication was limited to gestures, a nod, a touch, a command in broken German. Yet those gestures transcended language. For many prisoners, that silent mercy was the most powerful message they received during the entire war. If the Germans were stunned by compassion, the Americans were burdened by it. For the nurses, the emotional toll was immense. They lived in a world of contradictions, saving lives by day, hearing bombs fall by night. The faces of the wounded blurred together. Nationality ceased to matter, but at times the moral confusion became overwhelming. Some nurses wrote in letters home that they dreamed of the men they treated, not as soldiers, but as sons or brothers. They questioned why the world demanded such suffering at all. Yet they continued because stopping meant admitting that the war had stripped them of their humanity. Psychologists who studied returning medical staff after the war noted a recurring theme: compassion fatigue mixed with moral pride. The nurses carried scars invisible to the eye. They had looked into the faces of the enemy and refused to hate, and that, paradoxically, left its own kind of wound. One Army nurse summarized it in a 1946 interview. "You learn that mercy has a cost, but you pay it gladly because someone has to keep the world human." Their endurance redefined what courage meant. It was not just running into fire or holding a line. It was staying gentle in the presence of pain, even when the pain came from the hands of an enemy. Through these angles, leadership, perception, psychology, the event becomes more than an anecdote of kindness. It becomes a study in conscience. The act of treating German prisoners was not about sentimentality. It was about drawing a line in the ashes of Europe and saying, "This far, no further." When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, it was not victory alone that defined the Allies. It was restraint. In a world where every boundary had collapsed, between soldier and civilian, right and wrong, these nurses preserved one of the last unbroken principles of civilization. But even mercy has its breaking point, and as the war's bloodiest winter reached its height, that moral endurance was tested in ways no doctrine could prepare them for. Because soon compassion would be forced to share a tent with vengeance. The winter of Decision Ardennes Forest, January 1945. The snow had turned gray with ash. Trees were splintered into jagged spears and the roads were choked with the wreckage of tanks and trucks frozen into the mud. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate last offensive, was finally breaking apart. Thousands of German soldiers were dead, dying, or surrendering in droves. For the Americans, victory felt hollow. The cost had been staggering. Nearly 90,000 casualties, the bloodiest engagement the U.S. Army had ever fought. The medical corps was overwhelmed. Every available nurse, doctor, and stretcher bearer was working without rest, moving between the living and the dead in a blur of exhaustion. When the first waves of German prisoners began arriving, the atmosphere inside the field hospitals changed instantly. Many American infantrymen had lost close friends just days earlier, killed by the very soldiers now limping into the tents seeking help. The tension was almost physical. Guards stood rigid, hands on their rifles. Some medics muttered under their breath as they lifted stretchers. The nurses, faces pale with fatigue, carried on in silence. The 16th Evacuation Hospital near Bastogne recorded in its January logbook, received 32 German wounded in addition to 82 Allied, morale strained. Staff exhausted. Among those Germans was a young corporal, barely 19, his leg shattered by artillery fire. He was terrified and expecting execution. Instead, he found himself in a clean bed, his wound being washed by a woman who avoided his eyes. When she tied off the bandage, he whispered, Why?" She didn't answer. She just checked his pulse and moved on. Outside, the sound of engines filled the air as convoys brought more wounded from the front. Inside, there was no time for ideology, only triage. In one corner of the hospital, two men lay side by side, one German, one American. The German had been part of a tank crew that destroyed an American half-track the day before. The American had survived that explosion. Neither knew it, but they were connected by violence. The nurses did. Their orders were clear. Both received equal treatment. During the night, an argument broke out among a group of enlisted medics. One, a private from Ohio whose brother had been killed near St. Vith, refused to assist in treating the German. "He doesn't deserve it," he said bitterly. A senior nurse, Captain Margaret B. Hastings, intervened. She had been on duty for 60 hours straight. Her hands trembled as she held a lantern over the operating table. "Private," she said quietly. "If we stop being what we are, then this war will never end." He obeyed. The German was saved. So was the American beside him. That moment, recorded later in Hastings's journal, captures the essence of the Allied moral struggle. These were not soldiers fighting an abstract enemy. They were healers forced to face the face of hate and respond with care. The choice to continue treating the enemy was not just a regulation, it was defiance. The refusal to let vengeance rewrite the rules of humanity. Throughout January, the hospitals in Belgium and northern France were scenes of unrelenting chaos. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the stench of burned cloth and gunpowder. Generators hummed, scalpels clicked, stretchers clattered over frozen mud. And yet, amid that mechanical rhythm, there were moments of unbearable stillness, moments that would stay with those who survived. One nurse at the 77th Evacuation Hospital wrote later, "I was cleaning a German soldier's wound when he began to cry. Not from pain, but because I was gentle. He said he hadn't been touched kindly in years." Those words, scribbled in pencil on a crumpled notebook page, capture a quiet revolution in that tent. For that single instant, the war outside stopped existing. There were no allies or Axis, only the broken and the healers. As days passed, word spread among the POWs. The American nurses would treat anyone. Some surrendered simply to reach their care. One U.S. intelligence officer later reported that enemy wounded came in waving white cloths and shouting, "Nurse? Nurse!" instead of "Help!" It was a surreal inversion of war's logic. Compassion became a tactical reality, humanity a survival tool. As January gave way to February, the Allied front surged eastward. The hospitals followed, mobile, tireless, and cold. The nurses, many suffering from frostbite and exhaustion, worked beneath bombed-out roofs and shattered trees. They were no longer simply medical staff. They had become the moral guardians of the war's final chapter. Each act of healing was an act of defiance. Against despair, against vengeance, against the idea that war could consume everything good. And though the guns continued to roar across the horizon, something had shifted. The Germans arriving at those hospitals no longer looked at their captors with hatred. They looked at them with disbelief and often with shame. The nurses never asked for gratitude. They simply carried on, their faces calm, their voices steady. Somewhere in the frozen fields beyond Bastogne, the war was still raging. But inside those tents, lit by a single lantern smelling of iodine and diesel, a quieter kind of victory was being won. The moral climax of this story has now been reached, but the night was not over, because before dawn, that fragile humanity would face its most brutal test yet, when one hospital came under direct fire, and mercy itself was caught in the blast. Night of January 22, 1945, near Malmedy, Belgium. The storm had returned. Heavy snow and artillery shells fell together, the sky pulsing with red light from distant fires. Inside the 45th Evacuation Hospital, canvas walls shuddered with every blast. The nurses moved quickly, heads low as fragments of shrapnel tore through the trees outside. The front line had shifted closer, too close. They were supposed to evacuate hours ago, but the convoy trucks hadn't arrived. The wounded, as nearly 200 men, couldn't be moved. Half of them were Germans. Captain Anita Newcomb-McGee, head nurse of the night shift, checked the generator again. The fuel was almost gone. She could hear the low moans from the far corner, where the German patients lay. Their guards had retreated, leaving only the nurses, doctors, and orderlies. Then came the scream of incoming shells. Closer, sharper. The ground shook and the tent lights flickered out. For a moment there was nothing but darkness. Then the weak glow of flashlights trembling in hands slick with blood. Someone shouted, "Hit in Ward C!" Two nurses ran into the next tent. A shell fragment had torn through the roof, scattering debris and ripping through a row of cots. One of the dead was American. Two of the wounded were Germans. The choice was instant and impossible. There were only enough supplies to stabilize a few. The surgeon called out triage orders. The nurses obeyed without hesitation. The enemy soldiers received the same morphine, the same bandages, the same care. Outside, another shell landed. This time closer. The earth shook, dust falling like snow from the tent seams. Yet no one moved for the door. Later, in a debriefing, one of the nurses recalled, "We didn't think of them as Germans anymore. They were just people bleeding out. That was all." Hours passed like minutes. Snow drifted into the tents through the torn canvas. The air was so cold that the nurses' gloves froze stiff. They tore them off and worked barehanded, the skin of their fingers cracking and bleeding. One nurse, 23-year-old Lieutenant Helen Van Horn, held pressure on the wound of a German soldier who had taken shrapnel to the abdomen. He was fading fast, whispering in broken English, "Don't leave. Please." She stayed with him until he went still. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, and moved to the next cot. An American boy from Iowa with a crushed arm. She repeated the same words to him, "Don't leave. Please." For a few fleeting hours, the war disappeared. Inside that tent, compassion had no uniform. It was the only thing left that worked. By dawn, the shelling stopped. The silence was so sudden it felt deafening. The nurses stepped outside, their faces pale and their boots frozen to the ground. Around them, the trees were blackened, the air thick with smoke. The Red Cross flag above the hospital had been shredded by shrapnel, and yet, against all odds, they had saved more than half the patients. A military photographer arrived that morning and captured an image now buried in archives. A nurse. Her uniform burned at the sleeve, standing beside a German prisoner whose arm she had just splinted. They are both staring at the horizon, not as enemies but as survivors. After the attack, several of the German prisoners volunteered to help repair the damaged tents and carry stretchers. Their guards, astonished, allowed it. One German medic, himself a prisoner, approached Captain McGee and offered to assist with the wounded. She nodded silently. For the next 2 days, the captured Germans worked alongside the Americans, tending to the injured of both sides. No orders compelled them. It was a spontaneous alliance born of survival and gratitude. One witness described the sight. The Americans worked as if they were saving brothers. The Germans worked as if they were paying back a debt. For a brief time, war's hierarchy dissolved completely. In the frozen clearing outside Malmedy, compassion had rewritten the rules. Word of the hospital's stand spread quietly through nearby units. When Eisenhower's staff later reviewed the reports, they cited the nurses' conduct as an example of courage and composure under extreme conditions. But the soldiers who had been there described it differently. They called it the night mercy refused to die. When trucks finally arrived to evacuate the hospital, the nurses loaded the wounded first, Americans and Germans alike. As the convoy rolled out, a German prisoner in the back of one truck removed his cap and pressed it to his chest. A nurse sitting across from him later said she realized something then. We thought we were saving lives, but maybe we were saving something bigger, what was left of decency. The convoy moved west away from the front, leaving behind the cratered field where the tents had stood. The Red Cross flag still fluttered in the wind, tattered but visible, symbols not of safety but of stubborn grace. The soldiers who passed through that hospital carried more than scars. They carried memories of women who healed the enemy without hesitation, of nights when compassion stood firm against chaos. Years later, some of those German POWs would write letters to the United States Army archives. One of them ended with a single line: "You defeated us with kindness." The battle for Europe would rage on for months yet, but the moral turning point had already passed. In those tents, in that night of fire and frost, the war revealed its last remaining truth, that mercy, even under bombardment, is the most enduring act of defiance there is. When the snow finally melted from the forests of Belgium, the scale of the devastation emerged. Villages once hidden by white drifts were revealed as blackened skeletons. Fields were strewn with twisted metal and the remnants of desperate battles. But scattered among those ruins were stories of improbable survival. Men, both American and German, who owed their lives to the nurses who refused to draw. Lines in blood, the reports from field hospitals like the 45th and 16th evacuation. Units began to circulate through the Allied command structure. They were brief, factual, written in the dry language of military bureaucracy. Enemy wounded treated under fire. Personnel maintained discipline, losses minimal, morale sustained. Yet between the lines, a different message pulsed, that in a war drowning in cruelty, decency had endured. By the spring of 1945, the tide had turned completely. The Allies pushed into the heart of Germany. Cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg lay in ruin. Columns of German prisoners now stretched for miles along the roads, guarded not by hatred but by order. Among them were thousands who had once been treated in Allied hospitals, many still bearing American bandages or crutches stamped U.S. Army Medical Corps. For these men, captivity no longer felt like damnation. It felt like life. At its peak, the U.S. Army was holding over 370,000 German prisoners in camps across the European theater. Every one of them fell under the Geneva Convention's protection, which mandated humane treatment, food, shelter, and medical care equivalent to that given to Allied soldiers. But in practice, the Allies went further. American and British hospitals treated thousands of POWs with injuries sustained weeks or even months before capture. They performed reconstructive surgeries, amputations, and prosthetic fittings, all under conditions that were still perilous and undersupplied. Field hospitals in France and Belgium evolved into semi-permanent facilities, many staffed by the same nurses who had served through the winter. The work never slowed. Convoys arrived daily. Wounded prisoners, liberated forced laborers, Allied casualties. The nurses' endurance became legendary. One U.S. Army report from the 128th Evacuation Hospital, operating near Koblenz in April 1945, noted POWs received identical surgical priority as Allied wounded. Medical personnel exhibited outstanding composure and impartiality. It was the kind of language that would later find its way into post-war treaties. But in that moment, it was simply routine. The nurses were too tired to think of history. They were surviving 1 hour at a time. Still, their example traveled further than they knew. Journalists embedded with advancing Allied forces occasionally wrote brief stories for stateside newspapers, small columns buried on page 7 or 8, with headlines like "U.S. nurses treat German prisoners with same care as our boys." Readers back home were surprised, even uneasy. Many had lost sons and brothers in Europe. Some questioned why resources were being spent on the enemy, but others understood instinctively. This was what separated civilization from chaos. For the German prisoners, that understanding came slowly and painfully. They had been raised on a steady diet of ideology. The enemy was subhuman. The Reich was eternal, compassion was weakness. But lying on clean sheets, hearing English voices murmuring reassurance, forced a reckoning within them. Many of these men later gave interviews to Allied intelligence or wrote accounts after their release. The pattern was strikingly consistent. They spoke of confusion, disbelief, and eventually, gratitude. One former Wehrmacht officer captured near Aachen recalled in a 1946 interview, "I saw the nurse who saved my life crying over an American boy who had died. I realized then that she would have wept for me too. That broke me." Another wrote, "We learned more about democracy in that hospital than in 10 years of propaganda." These testimonies, collected quietly by the U.S. War Department, were never intended as propaganda, yet they became an unspoken tool of reconstruction. When the war ended and these men returned home, they carried with them not only memories of defeat, but memories of decency. In the grand chronicles of World War II, this story barely registered. Overshadowed by the fall of Berlin, the liberation of the camps and the atomic shadow rising over the Pacific. But for those who lived it, the small victories mattered most. For every German soldier who left an Allied hospital alive, a seed of transformation was planted. Some of those men would later become doctors, teachers, or community leaders in the new West Germany. Some wrote letters decades later, still remembering the American nurses who had treated them like human beings when no one else would. For the United States, these acts of mercy became a quiet form of diplomacy. They demonstrated to the world, and to the vanquished, that the Allies had fought not only to win a war, but to preserve the principles of humanity itself. And as Europe bled toward peace, the moral clarity forged in those tents became a foundation for the new world to come. But the story doesn't end there, because after the surrender, the flow of prisoners didn't stop. It grew, and now the war hospitals would have to face their greatest logistical and ethical test yet: how to heal an enemy nation without losing the will to keep healing. May 1945. The war in Europe ended not with a roar, but a collective exhale. From the ruins of Berlin to the coasts of France, silence rolled over a continent that had forgotten what silence sounded like. But for the Allied Medical Corps, and especially the nurses, there was no rest. The surrender unleashed a new kind of chaos. German soldiers, millions of them, laid down their arms and flooded the Allied zones. Among them were tens of thousands of wounded, shattered by artillery, frostbite, starvation, and despair. The hospitals, already stretched thin, now faced a humanitarian crisis unprecedented in modern warfare. Yet once again, the same principle held firm. Every life mattered. The American field hospitals moved eastward into Germany, transforming abandoned schools, warehouses, and even Nazi military hospitals into treatment centers. There was no celebration, no triumphalism, only work. Captain Margaret Hastings, the nurse who had stood firm during the Ardennes winter, later wrote in her diary, "Victory did not feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion. The only thing that mattered was to keep saving the ones we could." For the nurses who had seen the war's cruelty up close, this final mission felt almost sacred: to close the wounds of a world at war, one human body at a time. By the summer of 1945, the U.S. Army operated over 700 hospitals across Europe, including facilities dedicated exclusively to German POWs. Medical trains carried the wounded from the battlefields of Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Bavaria to vast compounds in France and the Rhineland. In some cases, German medical personnel were allowed to assist under Allied supervision. The collaboration was pragmatic, but it also planted seeds of mutual respect. German surgeons, now captives, were astonished by the resources and efficiency of the Allied system. Many American nurses, though still under strict military discipline, began to interact more openly with their German patients. A few even learned basic phrases: Schmerz, pain, Essen, food, du liebst, you live. These small exchanges carried more weight than orders or treaties. For the German soldiers, it was disarming. The women they had been taught to fear were now saving their lives. It was not forgiveness, but it was transformation. As one prisoner wrote in his camp diary in 1945, "I thought they would hate us. Instead, they healed us." It was harder to bear than punishment. The moral balance of the war had shifted. The victors were rebuilding the vanquished, not through speeches or decrees, but through hands, care, and quiet endurance. Back in the United States, the story continued. By late 1945, nearly 370,000 German POWs had been shipped to camps across America. Many of them were wounded, still requiring surgeries and long-term rehabilitation. In states like Texas, Kansas, and Georgia, hospitals inside these POW camps were run with the same standards as American military wards. Nurses worked side by side with captured German orderlies, maintaining order and care without cruelty. The reports shocked the prisoners, and amazed international observers. The International Red Cross, visiting camps from Alabama to Oregon, documented extraordinary standards of care and hygiene, and noted that German POW mortality in U.S. custody was less than 1%, an almost unheard-of figure in wartime. In 1946, as repatriation began, German soldiers boarded ships home carrying neatly packed personal effects, including medical records, prosthetic limbs, and letters of thanks to American nurses. Several testimonies surfaced later. In the camp hospital, they treated me as though I were one of their own. I left America with one leg and a different heart. These were not publicized widely. The world was too busy rebuilding, but their impact endured in quiet, invisible ways. The post-war years brought tribunals, reconstruction, and the long shadow of guilt. But underneath it all, the humanitarian conduct of Allied medical staff stood untouched, on a moral constant. In an age of ruin, historians would later call it the other front, the moral front, where compassion had fought and won its own war. The American nurses, many returning home in 1946 to 47, rarely spoke about what they had done. They blended back into civilian life, carrying with them the faces of both friend and foe. But military records, diaries, and post-war interviews preserved their legacy. It was their quiet professionalism that inspired reforms to the Geneva Convention of 1949, which expanded protections for medical personnel and prisoners of war. Their example also influenced future humanitarian doctrines, from Korea to Vietnam, proving that even amid brutality, ethical warfare was possible. The German POWs they treated went home to a shattered nation. Many never forgot what they had witnessed. In letters to the Red Cross and American veterans organizations, they wrote not of politics or ideology, but of compassion. One message from a former SS corporal dated 1954 read simply, "I was your enemy. You saved me." That is all I can say. The war had ended, but its moral echoes did not fade. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the quiet hospitals of Texas, one truth had been written across both victory and defeat, that mercy, once given, does not vanish. It lingers, and in memory and conscience, in history itself. And it was there, in the hands of the nurses who stitched the wounds of their enemies, that the true line between civilization and savagery was drawn. War is often remembered by its weapons, its generals, and its victories. But history's quietest triumphs are rarely written in steel. Sometimes they are written in touch, in hands that refuse to become instruments of hate. In the final months of World War II, when Europe was little more than ash and memory, the most extraordinary act was not conquest, and it was compassion. American nurses, exhausted, cold, and surrounded by death, chose to remain human. They treated their enemies with the same care they gave their own, and in doing so, they did something no bullet could achieve. They reminded the world what it meant to be civilized. The German soldiers who survived because of them carried those memories home, and those memories became a mirror for a nation rebuilding from ruin. Mercy, it turned out, could shape history as deeply as victory. For the nurses, there were no medals, no parades. They slipped quietly back into the world they had saved, their names forgotten by most. But every life they touched, every wound cleaned, every breath steadied, became part of something larger than war. It became proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, goodness did not surrender. The historian can measure battles in numbers. The nurse measures them in heartbeats, and it was those heartbeats, German and American alike, that carried civilization through the fire. In the end, the story of those tents and those women is not about mercy given to the enemy. It is about mercy given to the world, a world that needed to believe, even as it bled, that compassion could still win. And perhaps that is the final truth of war, that its greatest victories are not fought with rifles, but remembered in the quiet moments when one human being decides to save another, simply because they can.